Awesome. How's everyone doing? So I want to start by just saying, when it comes to Bitcoin, there is no marketing department. Bitcoin's success falls on the shoulders of the individuals. And so first off, let's just give a quick round of applause to everyone who kind of put together this conference, because it's this conference and these in-person meetings where ideas are created and they turn into the products and the companies we use today. So just a quick round of applause to everyone who put this together. I was thinking about what do I want to present on, and I've given this presentation once before to test it at a little Bitcoin meetup, and people seem to enjoy it, so I was like, you know what, this is a presentation that I really want to give at Learning Bitcoin, and I think it's really important. We live in a world where people are increasingly more and more disconnected, and we're struggling to figure out, why do I feel disconnected? What is causing me to feel disconnected? And so the idea behind this kind of little presentation is how money is very much impacting how we show up and live an authentic life. And it can sometimes feel a little abstract, and so I really want to try and ground the conversation. And I was meant to show the little reconnecting after introducing disconnected, but the idea is after this presentation, hopefully you'll feel as if Bitcoin gives a little bit of hope. It makes us feel like we're reconnecting again. And I'm sure people in this crowd very much believe Bitcoin is hope, and hopefully it will help create a more cohesive society. So I'm going to start with a story. My background, I was a backcountry mountain bike coach. I spent most of my life in the mountains, teaching people, trying to distill down complex biomechanical movements into their simplest form, and I absolutely loved it. And about 5-6 years ago, I ended up having an individual, a good friend of mine, reach out and say, hey Seb, I've got a handful of inspiring individuals. They want to go mountain biking. Would you be willing to take them? And I was like, no problem. So they came out from the interior, they came out to Whistler, and we ended up spending 5 days riding together. And while on this kind of journey, this adventure together, I was sat down one evening, and this individual, we were kind of talking, and he's unbelievably inspiring. He's kind of founded many of the companies which you guys are probably familiar with, and he was writing a book. And we start talking about a specific chapter. And this chapter talks about goal setting, how the world we live in today, the way we think about goal setting tends to be around the 3 Ps: prestige, power, and possessions. We tend to think about, man, how do I get the job so people look up to me so I have the power? How do I get the possessions? How do I get the Lamborghini, the Rolex watch? But in reality, if we stop and pause for a second, what actually brings us happiness is not the 3 Ps. It is not prestige, power, and possessions. What it is the 3 Cs: connections, contributions, and challenges. It's when we connect in our community, when we build friendships, when we build our relationships. It's when we contribute back to society, when we feel like we're creating value, when we're showing up and we're being a member of society or a member of our community. It is when we challenge ourselves, whether that's in our career, whether it's in our relationships, whether it's in kind of our hobbies, our sports. It's when we challenge ourselves. And so when I was speaking to him about the 3 Ps and the 3 Cs, why are we goal setting around the 3 Ps when what brings us happiness is the 3 Cs? It made me wonder, what is it about today's society that makes us look for a way out? So we're always looking to kind of happiness in the external world, buying the newest stuff, the power, the prestige, as opposed to looking for a way in. What is it about our world that is causing this looking for a way out? And so I want to kind of talk about this in this presentation. So I'm going to start with, where did we go wrong? Where did we go wrong as a society that led us down looking for a way out rather than a way in? That then leads us to, what are the repercussions of this kind of trajectory at which we're on, the challenges at which we're facing? And then finally, how do we reconnect as a society? And I'm sure, as you guys know, we're at a Bitcoin conference. I very much believe it is through Bitcoin. But anyway, let's start with, where did we go wrong as a society? Now, in a very simplistic term, let's break down what is our economy? How does our economy function? Because this will help understand where we went wrong. Now, the way I kind of tend to think about the economy, and this is kind of a core economic framework, is something called the 4 factors of production. That sounds pretty boring, so let's simplify it down. There's kind of 4 levers in society: land, labor, capital, and enterprise. Now, the land lever, you can think about it as all our natural resources. It's kind of the forests, it's the food in the land, it's the fish in the waterways, it's the minerals in the ground. These make up all of our products and our services and fuel us as individuals. Next up, we have kind of the labor lever. The labor lever is us as individuals being able to use our productive capacity to build houses, to be able to build goods and services, to be able to support others that make up these companies. And then we have the capital lever. You can think of this as the lifeblood. This is what companies use to purchase kind of goods and services. It's how they purchase the capital assets that make a company thrive. It's how we transact with one another. And then finally, we have the enterprise lever. And that is the ability to take land and all the resources, labor and capital, and then create technology and innovation and build the companies that change the world and improve our lives. And so our economy is made up of these 4 levers, and ultimately you can tinker with these levers and you alter the productivity and the trajectory of that economy. Now, when we actually look at our growth in an economy, out of these 4 levers, what governments have recognized is 3 of them create indirect change and 1 of them creates direct change. What I mean by that is out of these levers, land, labor, and enterprise create indirect change. If we want to change the world through the land lever or change our nation through the land lever, we've got to find a whole bunch more resources. Maybe find a whole new gold reserve that's going to help grow the economy. But the problem is we have a lot of regulation that impedes us from finding these new reserves. Okay, well, what about the labor lever? If we want to change the economy through the labor lever, we have to lower the average age of the workforce. That's very hard to do. In today's world, because of the monetary stress, the cost of living, the fear of the environmental side of things, people are very fearful about having kids. And we've also seen countries like China with their one-child policy, which has massively impacted people's ability to have kids. China is actually expecting their population to halve by 2050 because of this one-child policy. And so in order to increase the capacity of a society through the labor lever, we have to lower the average age of the workforce, but instead what we're seeing is we're seeing aging workforces, which means the productive capacity is being put off supporting the aging workforce. And so the labor lever is not going to work. And then finally, we have enterprise. Enterprise, if we want to create change through enterprise, we've got to create technology that ends up increasing our productivity, our efficiency, and the challenge with that, again, is the fact that when it comes to technology, it takes time for that technology to take effect. Think about AI. We're now seeing the amazing impacts of AI in society, but AI didn't start last year or the year before or the year before that. It started in the 50s and 60s. It has taken us 60 to 70 years to see the repercussions, the positive repercussions or ramifications of AI. And so once again, it's indirect change. So land, labor, and enterprise take time to create change in an economy to help increase the productivity, the efficiency of that workforce. So we're left with 1 lever. That lever is the capital lever. Governments have recognized that if we print money, if we stimulate the economy by just injecting cash into the economy, we see immediate change. And as they've recognized this, they continue to pull on the monetary lever. So we print money, and we print money, and we print money, and we get the law of diminishing returns. The more we print money, the more debt we take on, the less of an impact that money has on society. And so the result of that is we're seeing the devaluation. Life becomes harder because costs rise. And the extreme case of this would be Venezuela. Venezuela, in this picture here, this chicken, this 2-kilogram chicken, cost 14.6 million bolivars, and this was back in 2019. And just 1 month later, that same chicken cost 30 million bolivars. So the government had recognized, hey, if we keep pulling the monetary lever, maybe we can stimulate the economy. But what it resulted in was a complete devaluation of the currency. And that's why a chicken costs millions of bolivars. But unfortunately, Canada is not immune to this. Since the start of the pandemic, or just before the pandemic, the last 10 years, we have seen more money printed than in the previous 150 years combined. To me, that is like profound. We've printed more money in the last 10 years than the last 150 years combined since the inception of the Canadian dollar. And so you wonder, why is it that life seems to be getting harder? Why is it that our cost of living continues to rise? And I would argue that it is because we continually keep printing money. And the result of this is the average house in Canada from 1970 used to take 3 times the average Canadian's annual wage. But by 2025, the average house costs 9.7 times the average person's wage. And so wages just have not kept up with house prices. And that is because we continually print money. And it's the same thing if you wanted to buy equities. If you want to buy stocks, if you want to buy one share of the S&P 500, the 500 biggest companies in the US, it used to take 24 hours of the average Canadian's hourly wage. Today, it takes 251 hours. To me, that is profound. It takes almost 10 times or more than 10 times the amount of work time just to achieve one share of the S&P 500. So this is money really breaking down. And the repercussions of that are that 74.8% of North Americans live paycheck to paycheck. 3/4 of all Canadians and Americans, essentially they receive their paycheck and that goes out to expenses to be able to survive, and they have nothing left over to be able to go think for themselves, to be able to show up, to direct time towards their family, to direct time towards their passions. And so we've talked about where did we go wrong. We've talked about the problem, the trajectory we're on. We've got this money printing issue and we're incentivized to keep printing money to stimulate the economy. Well, next up, I kind of want to talk about the repercussions. We've spoken briefly about them, but what are the repercussions, not just on the financial side of things, but on how we show up as individuals? And so let's talk about the repercussions. Now, in psychology, my background, although it was mountain biking, I was also unbelievably passionate about how we show up as individuals, trauma, like what makes us who we are. And I went to study for a while to be a somatic therapist, and then I realized I've got too much trauma of my own. I don't think I can help people. I'm going to work on myself. And when I dove down the rabbit hole of psychology, most people in this room, if you've ever read any psychological books, you stumble across Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And what he talks about in this 5-tier pyramid is in order to be able to show up in life, you've got to first meet your basic needs. These are your physiological needs: food, water, and warmth. We cannot think about all of these other needs of ours until we get our basic needs met. Next up, we have our safety needs: resources, family, property. We then move up the chain, we get into belongingness and love. We start thinking about relationships and friends. And then we get up into esteem needs, confidence, respect for oneself, accomplishment, you name it. And then finally, we get up into self-actualization, morality, spirituality, creativity. And I think that the challenge we face today is that because money is breaking down and our purchasing power is declining, we get stuck on the bottom rung. Everyone's stuck trying to figure out, how do I put food on the table and a roof over my head? And so the challenge with broken money today, when our purchasing power is deteriorating, is we're falling down this ladder, this Maslow's hierarchy, and we're getting stuck on the bottom rung. The majority of people, unfortunately, are just trying to meet their basic survival needs, and they can't think about their belongingness and esteem needs. They can't think about spirituality or creativity or morality. How do I show up? What is it that motivates me most? And this is where I think if we can fix this aspect of life, how do you allow people to show up with more capacity? The world would be a very different place. And so there's a book that I read a little while back, and this book really stood out to me. And this book is called The Body Keeps the Score by an author called Bessel van der Kolk. And it says, if an organism is stuck in survival mode, its energies are focused on fighting off unseen enemies, which leaves no room for nurture, care, and love. For us humans, it means that as long as the mind is defending itself against invisible assaults, our closest bonds are threatened, along with our ability to imagine, plan, play, learn, and pay attention to other people's needs. And so the way I interpret this is that as our monetary system is breaking down, as we're trying to simply survive, it means our aperture of awareness is narrowing as a result of the stress and the fear we're facing, and we're just trying to put food on the table and a roof over our heads. And that gives us very little capacity to think about how we imagine, how we plan, how we play, how we learn. And if you ever dive into psychology as well, what they also talk about is when we feel stressed, when we're under this immense pressure, our prefrontal cortex, the front section of our brain, shuts down. Well, it's our prefrontal cortex that's actually involved in planning, in rationality, in connection, and so it impacts our ability to show up on those levels when we're facing this immense financial pressure. And now, as a complete side tangent, I was on Preston Pish's podcast, the Investors Podcast, a little while back, and I mentioned one book that has absolutely stood out to me has been The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And I've never listened to this person speak. I've only just read their book. And I just said, I was like, you know what? She does such a phenomenal job, Bessel. Bessel is actually a Dutch guy with a beard. So I wouldn't, if you're recommending it, it's a guy, it's not a girl. But anyway, to me, money, as we're talking about these invisible assaults, money is this kind of mental tax. The more unstable the currency, the more of our mind share it consumes. When we're stressed about money, we don't have time to think about these other things. And this is kind of the degradation of money on how we show up as individuals. And the result of that is that in the US, when we're looking at, say, 30-year-olds, we're seeing adulthood delayed or even denied. And so here's 4 little charts which really highlight this. Of the 30-year-olds who live on their own, we've seen that drop in the 1980s from nearly close to 90% down to below 65%. We've seen have ever married from 80% below 50%. What about like live with a child? From 60% dropping close to 30%. And own a home from 50% down to 35%. And there's one more statistic. I remember reading this reading this article by, I think it was the Washington Post. And it was talking about home ownership with millennials. And it said that the baby boomer generation at the average age of 30 owned 35% of the housing market, while the millennial generation at the average age of 30 owns just 3% of the housing market. Highlighting again that house prices, unfortunately, have far outstripped wage growth. It's becoming harder to get ahead. And so when money fails to store value, we look for a way out rather than a way in. We disconnect from ourselves. So as I mentioned earlier, we start to look for the prestige, the power and possessions, the 3 Ps, as opposed to the connections, the contributions, and the challenges. We're always looking for these external fixes as opposed to how do I show up more authentically? How do I have more capacity? And so as we've discussed where we went wrong and what are the repercussions of this trajectory we're on, I want to kind of finally ground this conversation in how do we reconnect as a society? And so, as of course you guys probably know, I'm going to talk about Bitcoin, but I want to start by saying the world we live in today, it is no longer about saving, it's about what you're saving in. And this is really important. One of my best friends in Whistler, she inherited about $100,000 from her parents. This was maybe 10 years ago. And I remember her coming to me and being like, Seb, I don't know what to do with this. And at the time, this is pre-Bitcoin for me, I was in real estate and I was just like, maybe let's try and find a place, let's try and find a piece of land. And we kind of searched out a bunch of options, but in the end she got option paralysis and she kept that money in her bank account, she never invested it. That money still sits there today, that $100,000. She hasn't invested it in 10 years. And during that same time, house prices in Whistler have tripled. So what you can effectively say is that $100,000 is now worth what $33,000 was worth back when she got it. So she lost almost 70% of her purchasing power as a result of simply that option paralysis, not knowing what to do, and holding her purchasing power in the currency. As our currency degrades, it basically just takes our purchasing power, the ability to show up. And so it's not about it's not about just simply saving, it is about what we're saving in. Now, in order to be able to save, we've got to save in what we think is the best store of value. And there are countless stores of value out there. When it comes to these different savings tools, we could have invested in wheat over the last 5 years and we'd have outperformed the Canadian dollar. You could have even done better if you just invested in cocoa. Maybe, I don't know if any of you guys invest in cocoa, that's massively outperformed the Canadian dollar. But out of all of those, as I'm sure you guys know, the best performing asset was XRP. No, I'm just teasing, it's Bitcoin. And so Bitcoin really has outperformed everything else. And what that means is that what people want today costs less tomorrow in Bitcoin. And this, to me, when you grok this, when you grasp this, it truly is a profound moment. If Bitcoin is going up faster than everything else, if you flip that on its head, what that actually means is that everything else is falling in relation to Bitcoin. So things become cheaper in Bitcoin terms. Whether you're trying to buy other assets, trying to buy a house to put a roof over your head, whether you're trying to buy food, whatever it is you're trying to purchase becomes easier to purchase in Bitcoin over time. And we see this in real terms. The house we were talking about previously that was getting more expensive, in 2014, the average Canadian house cost $402,000. In Bitcoin, that was 1,054 Bitcoin. Well, if we fast forward 10 years later, that same house has doubled in price in Canadian dollars to nearly 17,700, 700,017, suck at math, to just 8 Bitcoin. So we've seen a 99% drop in the purchasing price of houses as a result of Bitcoin. That is amazing. That gives you so much more capacity and hope for the future. That instills meaning when you're able to show up more authentically to support your family, when house prices are dropping in Bitcoin terms. And this is not possible if it wasn't for, I would argue, 3 core characteristics of Bitcoin. The first one of those is Bitcoin is trustless and permissionless. And this is unbelievably important. You need a system that you no longer rely on middlemen, and you do not need permission to be able to spend your money. If we kind of like rewind to the start of the pandemic, you guys may be familiar with the trucker rally or the trucker convoy. Individuals who didn't agree with what was happening in the government tried to protest and push back a little bit. They tried to express what it is that they value through free speech. And simply because they expressed it, the government froze their bank accounts and prevented them from spending their money to be able to show up. And so this is a permissioned system as opposed to a permissionless system. Bitcoin is permissionless, which is unbelievably important because what it means is capital flows to where value is being created, as opposed to when we have a permission system, capital only flows to where government authorizes capital to flow. And so we need a system where money can flow to where value is being created. Secondly, Bitcoin is decentralized. And as I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with, what that essentially just means is we have distributed that trust a whole bunch of different entities. And so Bitcoin is not built upon rules, it is built upon rulers. Nope, the other way around. And so this is really important. If we've got a system built upon rules instead of rulers, that essentially means everyone plays by the same rules. Whether you're an individual on the street or an elite, we all play by the same rules. Our current system is not like that. We have a central bank, and that central bank can devalue the currency at will, and unfortunately it's the currency holders that experience that devaluation through a loss of purchasing power. And so when you have a system where everyone plays by the same rules, we're all playing the same game. We're all pushing for the same outcome. And then finally, and I would argue most importantly, is Bitcoin is scarce. Bitcoin will only ever have 21 million, or just shy of 21 million. And this is unbelievably important. Jeff Booth talks about it in his book, The Price of Tomorrow. And what he talks about is this fact that as humans, we have an innate desire to want to improve the world we live in. We always want to innovate. We want to increase our productivity. We want to increase our efficiency. And it is through this increasing of productivity and efficiency that prices should fall. Take the apple. 200 years ago, if you had a little apple farmer, he could only grow during certain months of the year. So during those 3, 4, 5 months of the year, that's the only time that he could really grow and harvest those apples. And then on top of that, he had to watch those apple trees to make sure pests weren't getting at them, birds weren't eating the apples. And then on top of that, if he wanted to take them to market, he'd have to pick them all by hand, he'd have to load them into his horse and cart, and then he had to take his little horse and trot down the road to his local market. He was very limited in where he could distribute these apples. Well, fast forward to today, and we have fertilizers and herbicides. I don't agree with them, but we have fertilizers and herbicides to massively increase the yield and reduce the impact of pests on those crops. We have greenhouses so we can grow year-round as opposed to just within the short window. And then on top of that, we have planes, we have cars, we're able to transport these goods, these apples, anywhere in the world. And so our efficiency, our ability to produce apples has increased exponentially by, I would argue, a factor of 1,000. But the cost has gone up, which doesn't make sense. Prices should fall. But unfortunately, because we're printing money at a faster rate than technology is driving down prices, we don't realize those falling prices. And so when you have an asset that is truly scarce, what that means is as a society, as we grow, as we have more goods, we have more services, as people want to innovate, prices should fall over the long term. So life starts to get easier. And this is where, again, just to quote Jeff Booth one more time, abundance in money equals scarcity in everything else. Scarcity in money creates abundance in everything else. And the way I interpret this is you just need to look at somewhere like Whistler. If we just drove a little further north to the ski town of Whistler, 61% of houses in Whistler are empty. And you wonder, why? We're in a housing crisis. Why are 61% of houses empty? And it's because when we have abundance in money, people no longer want to store their purchasing power in the money. So they look elsewhere to store their purchasing power in things that are somewhat scarce. And they go and flood into things like real estate, things like farmland. And so they end up taking these productive utility vehicles, like houses, like farmland, that put a roof over people's heads, that grow crops and food to be able to support the community. They take these things off the market simply to go and preserve purchasing power. And so this is why places like Whistler have a housing crisis while 61% of the houses are empty. The flip side is true when it comes to Bitcoin. When it comes to Bitcoin, when you have scarcity in money, all of a sudden we're incentivized to save in the currency again. And as you're incentivized to save in the currency again, we're going to see capital flee a lot of these traditional asset classes that are now being used to preserve purchasing power and flood back into the currency. And what that means for the average individual is that life starts to get easier again. The ability to put a roof over our heads becomes easier again. To put food on the table becomes easier again. And so you start to have abundance in everything else. Abundance to be able to show up as individuals. And so we spoke about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And if we were to revisit this hierarchy underneath a Bitcoin standard, it looks very different. Rather than us getting stuck on the bottom, our physiological needs, our safety needs, putting a roof over our head and food on the table, we're able to venture up the pyramid. As Bitcoin's purchasing power increases, life gets easier. We can start thinking about our belongingness. We can start thinking about our esteem needs. We can start thinking about self-actualization, being the best version of ourselves. We have the time and the capacity to look inwards and ask, how do I want to show up? What is it that actually motivates me? What am I passionate about? And that is something that's missing in today's society. And so, while Bitcoin is able to return our energy, we've got this fiat system that is demanding more and more and more of our energy. And so, if Bitcoin is returning our energy and our capacity, we can focus on what's important to us. Whether that is the mountains, whether that is art and creative pursuits, whether it's starting a podcast, whether it's our relationships, building a family, as we have more capacity, we can show up to more of these areas in our life that really kind of help us thrive and make us feel more whole. And this isn't just theoretical. When you interact with Bitcoiners, you hear these phenomenal stories about how Bitcoin has completely changed their life. I had a guy, when was it? Maybe about 2 months ago, reach out to me. And this guy basically just said, hey Seb, like, would you have a few minutes to talk? I want to kind of share what I'm doing. And I was like, no sweat. So we jumped on a call and he introduced himself and he said he used to be a nuclear weapons technician in the military in the US. And he realized, what am I doing with my life? I don't enjoy this. This is not fun. What I really want to do is ecological restoration. I want to be able to restore our natural environment. He's not drawn to the military-industrial complex. He didn't feel like he was offering value and didn't want to support that. So eventually he plucked up the courage and he quit. But to him, ecological restoration was just a dream, a far-off dream. There was no way he was going to be able to, how would he afford to buy massive swaths of land to be able to go restore them? That just, it's not possible. And then he found Bitcoin. And he didn't think anything of it at first. He was just looking at Bitcoin because it was an asset that was going up. So he started buying Bitcoin in around 2015, if I remember correctly. And at that time, Bitcoin was relatively cheap. It's quite a bit cheaper than what it is today. But as Bitcoin started to appreciate, that dream started to come into reality. And then he realized, actually, man, if I sell a tiny bit of my Bitcoin, I can actually buy a plot of land. So he bought this plot of land, and he started to restore that local environment on his plot of land. And he developed these skills of ecological restoration. And then from there, he started a nonprofit. And the nonprofit, he basically ended up taking an investment in Bitcoin, returning a dividend yield, and the remaining return he put into restoring land. And now he's restored thousands of acres across the US as a result of Bitcoin. So this is where Bitcoin, although it is money, digital money, the irony of Bitcoin is it gets us to stop thinking about money. It gets us to think about how we want to show up and be able to pursue our dreams, these things that we thought were once far off. And that's where Bitcoin really is incredible. And so this is turning something that was once a dream for this guy, ecological restoration, into a non-profit that is now turning Bitcoin investment into restoring the natural environment while creating a return for those investors. So it creates incentives both ways to protect the investor and the environment, which is truly profound. And so to kind of wrap this up, when money successfully stores value, we look for a way in rather than a way out, a deeper connection with oneself. And I've noticed this on my own kind of journey. The more I spend time in the Bitcoin community, the more incredible individuals I meet, the more individuals that want to have family, the more individuals that want to have kids, the more individuals that want to be the best version of themselves. They want to give back to society. We have this lack of kind of compassion and altruism in society because people's aperture of awareness is so narrow because they're simply trying to survive. When it comes to Bitcoin, it's the inverse. We have this group of individuals, and they may not be in the financial position they're at yet, but because of their savings and their confidence in this trajectory we're on, it gives them the capacity to show up more authentically. And to me, that is what I think is so incredible about Bitcoin. When we go back to the 3 Ps and the 3 Cs that we started with, prestige, power, and possessions, where people are looking for a way out, under a Bitcoin standard, we're really looking for a way in. Connections, contributions, and challenges. And to me, that's where Bitcoin really excels more than anything else in this world. And so I just want to kind of thank everyone for kind of coming out today. If you want to learn more about this stuff, well, I really appreciate it. And if you want to learn more about this stuff, you can find me on Twitter or X at Seb Bunney. I work for a company called Block Reward, so if you've got companies and you want to pay your employees in Bitcoin, you want to incentivize them in Bitcoin, we do that. And then we've got a whole bunch of learning resources at Looking Glass Education. And of course, I have a book, The Hidden Cost of Money, and B is for Bitcoin. But again, I really appreciate you guys, and thanks for coming out.